The crystal champagne flute shattered against Maya's cream silk maternity dress before the orchestra even stopped playing. Cold vintage Dom Perignon soaked through the delicate fabric. The liquid turned icy against the swollen, aching curve of her 7-month belly. The grand baccarat chandelier of the St. Regis Aspen cast fractured prisms of light across the expanding wet stain over her heart. 400 of America's wealthiest titans stopped speaking. The silence in the ballroom tasted of roasted pheasant, black truffle oil, and raw, unrestrained cruelty. Julian stepped over the jagged shards of glass. His bespoke charcoal worsted wool suit, the one she had ironed herself yesterday morning out of sheer habit, drank the room's ambient light. He did not extend a hand to help her wipe her face. He just stared. His jaw locked. A vein along his temple rose visible beneath his skin. Maya pressed both palms flat against her belly. The baby fluttered, a panicked series of tiny kicks. Arthur Jr. sensed the terror. She forced her breathing to slow. She kept her chin parallel to the marble floor. She did not scream. She would never give him the satisfaction of a scream. "Look at you." Julian's voice boomed through the cavernous space, amplified by the sudden hush. He smoothed his silk lapel with a casual flick of his wrist. He was enjoying this. "Look at this pathetic, clinging parasite trying to play the billionaire's wife. Vanguard Holdings is the apex of global finance, Maya. We buy prime ministers. We reshape skylines. We dictate the markets before the opening bell even rings." He paced a slow, deliberate circle around her. His Italian leather Oxfords clicked against the floor. Click, click, click. "And you? You scrubbed baseboards at the plaza before you trapped me. You thought expanding your waistline would secure your permanent place at my table? You thought this mongrel in your stomach meant you belonged in Aspen on New Year's Eve?" Maya's lungs burned. She held his gaze. Her silence was a fortress. A sharp metallic clatter broke the quiet. Chloe stepped out from the shadows of the massive swan eye sculpture. She wore a crimson satin gown that dipped to the base of her spine, trailing across the floor like fresh blood. A dozen heavy gold bangles crashed together on her wrist as she draped her arms over Julian's shoulders. The scent of her overpowering Tom Ford Black Orchid perfume invaded Maya's space. "Julian, baby, she's ruining the midnight reveal. She ruins everything she breathes on." Chloe laughed. The sound was high, thin, scraping against the grandeur of the room. She traced Julian's jawline with a ruby-painted nail. "It's a tragedy. A maid playing dress-up in stolen silk. Tell her the truth, darling. Tell her why her little Cinderella fantasy expires tonight." Julian leaned closer, his voice echoing across the ballroom hush. "She is a piece of cheap hotel furniture. You use it, you break it, and you leave it by the dumpster." The guests chuckled at the cruel comparison. "Did you really believe Vanguard Holdings would pass its legacy to the son of a domestic worker?" He chuckled. The sound was dark and hollow. He gestured grandly toward Chloe. Chloe rested her manicured hand conspicuously flat against her own stomach. "Chloe is carrying the true Vanguard heir, a boy of pedigree, a boy whose bloodline matches the empire he will inherit. I kept you around this long only because my mother insisted on verifying the paternity. But you are a liability now, a stain on the Vanguard reputation." 30 feet away, behind the mahogany-tasting bar, Elias Thorne stood motionless. He wore the crisp black tuxedo of the St. Regis head sommelier. He held a microfiber cloth in his left hand. He held a wide, bold burgundy glass in his right. He did not polish it. He did not move a muscle. A tiny, matte black lapel pin on his collar blinked with a microscopic green light. It recorded the audio. It captured the digital video. Elias committed every word, every sneer, every spilled drop of champagne to a secure offshore server. He observed the scene with the cold detachment of a man who knew the true power dynamics of the room, even if no one else did. The crowd parted. Beatrice Vanguard, Julian's mother, glided forward. She wore a silver mink coat draped over her shoulders and an expression of pure, refined disgust. She carried a silver cane with a diamond-encrusted handle. She did not need the cane for walking. She used it for pointing. She pointed the heavy silver tip directly at the swollen center of Maya's belly. "I told you 3 years ago, Julian. You bring a stray dog into the house, you get fleas on the furniture." "Mother is right," Julian's voice echoed across the vaulted ceiling. "I tried to be charitable. I gave you a roof. I gave you a name. I let you pretend you were my equal. Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain the illusion that you belong here? The PR spins, the wardrobe? My God, Maya, even dressed in a $5,000 cream silk maternity gown, you still smell like bleach and cheap laundry detergent." Maya closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She felt Arthur Jr. turn inside her. She rested her hands on the heavy, low weight of her stomach. She opened her eyes. She stared directly into Julian's pupils. She did not shed a single tear. While Julian paced around her, mocking her maid origins, Maya stared at his expensive shoes. He believed he was a king. He believed Vanguard Holdings was an impenetrable fortress built by his grandfather's genius. He believed his family's blood ran colder and purer than anyone else's on Earth. He did not know the truth. He did not know about the winter of 2006. He did not know that his father had sat weeping in a leather chair in a private London office, begging for salvation. He did not know that Vanguard Holdings had been hours away from liquidation, suffocating under a mountain of toxic debt. He did not know that her father, a man who preferred shadows to spotlights, a man who built empires while the world slept, had wired $500 million to the Vanguard accounts. An anonymous loan, a silent lifeline, a debt that had compounded in the dark for 20 years. Maya had hidden her surname. She had hidden her father. She had taken a job scrubbing the baseboards of the Plaza Hotel just to escape the crushing weight of the Sterling legacy. She had met Julian in that hallway. She had believed his smiles. She had believed his whispered promises in the hotel laundry room. She had wanted to be loved for the calluses on her hands, not the billions in her trust fund. She wanted his heart. She earned his unwavering contempt instead. Tonight, she finally witnessed the monstrous reality of his true nature. "Nothing to say?" Julian taunted. He stepped closer. His chest almost touched her face. "No begging? No pleading for a monthly stipend? That's what you women always want, isn't it? A payoff." He reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a thick, folded stack of crisp $100 bills. He tossed them. The money hit Maya's collarbone. The bills fluttered to the marble floor, scattering around her cream satin flats. "There is your severance. Pick it up. Go back to whatever roach-infested Brooklyn tenement you crawled out of. You are done here." Maya remained statuesque. She let the money lie on the ground. Chloe smirked. She adjusted the heavy diamond collar around her neck. The gems caught the light, loud and obnoxious. "She is waiting for you to call her a cab, Julian. The help always expects a tip." Julian laughed. "She can walk. The fresh mountain air will do her good." Maya finally spoke. Her voice was steady, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "It is 10 degrees outside. I have no coat." Julian's smile vanished, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Do I look like a coat check attendant to you?" Beatrice stepped forward. She drove the rubber tip of her silver cane into the toe of Maya's shoe. "You heard my son. You have overstayed your welcome. This is a private event for the Vanguard family and our investors. You are neither." The grand doors of the ballroom stood at the far end of the hall. Beyond them, a massive wall of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooked the Aspen mountainside. A blizzard raged outside. Thick, angry flakes of snow battered the reinforced glass. The wind howled, a low, guttural moan that penetrated the heavy walls. Maya felt a sharp contraction ripple across her lower abdomen. She gritted her teeth. She tightened her grip on her belly. The baby was dropping lower. The stress was forcing her body into a state of panic. She breathed in through her nose. She held the air in her lungs. She released it slowly. The guests murmured. Wealthy socialites in designer gowns leaned in to whisper to investment bankers. Flashes from a rogue cell phone camera strobed in the peripheral vision. They were documenting her ruin. Julian turned to the crowd. He raised his arms like a victorious gladiator. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. Vanguard Holdings values integrity above all else. Tonight, we purge the fraud from our ranks and step into a new era of unprecedented prosperity. Champagne for everyone." The crowd erupted into polite, sycophantic applause. Julian turned back to Maya. The theatrical smile melted off his face. "Get her out of my sight!" Chloe stepped forward. She shoved Maya's shoulder. The force was sudden. Maya stumbled backward. Her cream flats lost traction on the slick champagne-soaked marble. She caught herself on the edge of a velvet-draped cocktail table. "Move, peasant!" Chloe hissed the words. Her gold bracelets clanged together. Beatrice stepped up beside Chloe. The older woman grabbed Maya's upper arm. Her grip was like a steel vise. Her long fingernails dug into Maya's skin through the silk sleeve. "Walk!" They marched her down the center aisle of the ballroom. 400 pairs of eyes watched. Maya kept her chin raised. She placed both hands over her belly, shielding the unborn child from the malicious energy radiating from every corner of the room. Elias Thorne remained by the ice sculpture. He watched the procession pass. His face revealed nothing. The tiny green light on his lapel continued to blink. He memorized the exact angle of Beatrice's grip. He logged the exact shade of Chloe's red dress. He recorded the exact cadence of Julian's footsteps following closely behind them. The heavy brass handles of the St. Regis exit doors came into view. The security guards in black suits stepped aside. They did not intervene. Julian owned the security company. Julian owned the building. Julian owned everyone in Aspen. Or so he thought. Julian pushed past his mother. He grabbed the brass handle. He shoved the heavy door open. A blast of sub-zero wind ripped into the foyer. The freezing air hit Maya's face like a physical blow. The snow swirled into the lobby, melting instantly on the heated floors. "Out!" Maya braced her feet. The cold was paralyzing. "Julian, my purse is in the suite. My medical records. My phone." "You own nothing. Everything you brought into my house was purchased with my money. You leave with the clothes on your back. Consider the dress a parting gift." Chloe leaned against the doorframe. She shivered theatrically, clutching her own bare arms. Hurry up, Julian. The cold is bad for my baby. Julian placed both hands on Maya's shoulders. He leaned in close. His warm breath smelled of expensive scotch and mint. If you ever try to contact me, I will have my lawyers bury you so deep in litigation you will never see daylight. If you try to claim a dime of child support for that bastard, I will have you arrested for extortion. You are a ghost. You never existed. Julian shoved her. He used both hands. He drove his weight forward. Maya lost her footing. The marble gave way to icy concrete. Her cream flat skidded on the frozen stone. She fell backward. She twisted her torso mid-air. She refused to land on her stomach. She took the impact on her right hip. The concrete sent a shockwave of agony up her spine. She gasped. The icy air burned her lungs. Snow instantly began to accumulate on her cream silk dress. The thin fabric offered no protection against the biting aspen wind. Julian stood in the warm, golden light of the doorway. Beatrice stood over his right shoulder. Chloe stood over his left. "Close the door." Julian stepped back. He grabbed the brass handle. "Goodbye, Maya. Enjoy the snow." The heavy oak and glass doors swung shut. The brass latch clicked into place. The deadbolt engaged with a heavy, metallic thud. The warm light of the ballroom faded. The snow fell. The wind howled. Her hip throbbed. Nobody came. She lay on the frozen concrete of the loading dock, both hands pressed flat against her swelling belly, listening to the muffled thumping of the orchestra playing a waltz behind the thick glass doors. The cold seeped through the thin silk. Her teeth began to chatter. Her fingers grew numb. She curled into a tight ball around her child. Arthur Jr. kicked against the cold. She needed to stand. She needed to walk. She needed to find a hospital. The wind bit into her exposed neck. She closed her eyes. The cold consumed her. The freezing wind sliced through the thin cream silk. Snowflakes the size of crushed pearls melted against the rich brown skin of her exposed collarbone. The rough, salted concrete of the St. Regis loading dock bit into her right hip. Stray ice crystals from the exhaust vents above rained down on her bare arms. The massive steel trash compactors hummed a low industrial drone, vibrating through the frozen ground beneath her. A sharp, rhythmic pulse radiated down her thigh, echoing the heavy bass of the orchestra still playing inside the grand ballroom. She pressed both palms flat against her belly. The baby was frantic. Arthur Jr. kicked against the tightening uterine wall, fighting the sudden drop in temperature. She gasped. The air burned. Her hip throbbed. The dark aspen sky spun above her. Her dark fingertips turned the color of bruised plums. The spilled vintage Dom Perignon froze into a stiff, fragrant armor across her chest. It smelled of rotting yeast and ruined promises. A massive tremor seized her shoulders. She forced her jaw shut, her teeth ground together. A dull ache blossomed behind her ears. She would not scream. She would not freeze here in the shadow of Julian's empire. The wind howled a low, guttural warning. It swept fresh powder over her bare legs. The thin cream satin flats offered zero insulation against the accumulating ice. She needed to move. The cold crept past her frozen skin and seeped deep into her aching joints. She rolled onto her left side. The movement sent a jagged spike of white-hot agony through her pelvis. She braced her trembling forearms against the frost. She pushed, her elbows locked, her shoes found zero grip. She slipped hard, her chin struck the ice. The taste of copper flooded her mouth. A warm drop of blood slid down her frozen chin. She spat a bright red droplet onto the pristine white snow. It bloomed like a tiny crimson rose against the ice. Maya closed her eyes for a single, agonizing second. The image of Julian's face burned behind her eyelids, the contempt in his eyes, the casual flick of his wrist tossing crisp $100 bills at her feet, the way he placed his hands on her shoulders and shoved. She opened her eyes. The terror dissolved into something cold and hard. She tried again. She dug her manicured fingernails into the frozen grout lines of the brick loading bay wall. Brick by rough brick, she dragged her heavy center of gravity upward. Her muscles shook with the monumental effort. Her knees trembled beneath the wet silk. She stood. She wrapped both arms around the heavy, low swell of her stomach. The sharp, panicked contractions had faded, replaced by a dull, continuous cramping that radiated into her lower back. She needed heat. She needed a heartbeat monitor. She needed a doctor. The heavy steel service door behind her hissed open. Warm air spilled into the alley. The familiar, suffocating scent of roasted pheasant and black truffle oil washed over her shivering frame. Maya did not turn around. She braced her battered shoulders for the arrival of Julian's private security. She prepared for the final, humiliating shove into the snowbank. She tightened her grip on her belly, turning her body to shield the child from the coming impact. A heavy weight settled over her shoulders. It was not a rough hand. It was a thick, lined cashmere overcoat. The luxurious fabric held the faint aroma of cedarwood and expensive cigar smoke. The sudden, enveloping warmth felt like a physical shock to her freezing nervous system. Maya turned her head. Elias Thorne stood in the ankle-deep snow. The St. Regis head sommelier wore his crisp black tuxedo without a jacket. The biting aspen wind whipped his white dress shirt against his muscular torso. He did not shiver. His face remained a mask of polite, professional detachment. The tiny matte black lapel pin on his collar was gone. He extended a black leather-gloved hand. He did not grab her arm. He offered the gesture, waiting for her permission. Maya stared at his steady palm. She looked into his dark, unreadable eyes. There was no pity in them. Pity was for the weak. Pity was what Julian offered to charities for tax write-offs. This man offered silent, calculated respect. She placed her freezing, plum-colored fingers into his leather glove. Elias guided her away from the loading dock. His footsteps crushed the fresh snow with heavy, even crunches. Crunch, crunch, crunch. He led her past the line of snow-covered delivery trucks to a sleek, idling Blacktown car waiting at the edge of the service alley. The exhaust plumed into the night air like dragon's breath, thick and white against the darkness. He opened the heavy rear door. The plush leather interior radiated a steady, artificial heat from the floorboard vents. A faint jazz melody played from a hidden speaker, barely a whisper against the howling storm outside. The contrast was dizzying. Maya climbed inside. She sank into the deep seat, pulling the oversized cashmere coat tight around her belly. Her bones ached as the ambient warmth began to thaw her freezing skin. Elias leaned in. He reached into his tailored tuxedo trouser pocket. He pulled out a thick, unmarked black card. He placed it flat onto the center console next to her trembling hand. He stepped back. He closed the door. The town car glided through the blizzard. The driver never spoke. The privacy partition remained locked in the upright position, a solid wall of tinted glass separating Maya from the front seat. The heavy winter tires chewed through the accumulating snow, carrying her away from the towering glass facade of the Grand Hotel. Maya stared at the black card resting on the illuminated console. She picked it up. A single embossed gold phone number caught the dim streetlights passing by the tinted window. No name, no corporate logo, just 10 digits stamped into heavy cardstock. She traced the raised numbers with her numb thumb. She slipped the rigid card into the concealed pocket of her ruined cream silk dress. The heat inside the cabin turned the frozen champagne back into liquid. The vintage Dom Perignon soaked her skin anew, cold and sticky against the heavy swell of her stomach. She shivered. She wrapped her arms tighter around Arthur Jr. The baby remained dead still. The earlier frantic kicks had ceased. A suffocating panic rose in her throat. She pressed her fingertips deep into the soft flesh of her lower abdomen, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. She stared out the window. The snow fell in blinding sheets. The world outside was a chaotic white blur, mimicking the sudden, terrifying emptiness in her womb. The neon red emergency sign of Aspen Valley Medical Center bled through the falling snow. The car stopped under the illuminated concrete canopy of the emergency entrance. The driver stepped out into the storm and opened her door. Maya stepped onto the cleared pavement. Her ruined satin flat squeaked against the wet concrete. Before she could turn to nod her thanks, the heavy door slammed shut. The Blacktown car accelerated into the whiteout, vanishing like a phantom into the storm. The sliding glass doors parted. The sterile, blinding fluorescent light of the emergency room assaulted her dilated pupils. The sharp smell of industrial bleach and rubbing alcohol replaced the lingering scent of vintage champagne. A digital clock on the wall blinked the time in glaring red numbers, 12:42 in the morning. The waiting room was empty, save for a sleeping man in the corner clutching a bruised arm and a single nurse behind the front desk. The triage nurse behind the plexiglass counter looked up. Her fingers stopped typing. Her eyes widened at the sight of the soaked cream silk, the drying blood on Maya's rich brown chin, and the massive man's cashmere coat dwarfing her shivering frame. Maya ignored the stare. She did not rush the desk. She did not ask for help. She walked to the nearest plastic waiting chair with the slow, heavy grace of a queen ascending a fractured throne. The blue vinyl squeaked under her weight. She sat down. She placed both hands firmly over Arthur Jr. The baby was still, too still. Panic clawed at the edges of her mind. She forced the terror down. She inhaled the sharp, sterile air through her nose. She held it for 3 seconds. She exhaled slowly through parted lips. Julian wanted her broken. He wanted her begging outside the St. Regis, hammering her bloody fists against the reinforced glass while his wealthy friends watched and laughed. He expected her to crawl back to the unheated Brooklyn tenement he mocked. He believed Vanguard Holdings had erased her existence. He was wrong. She looked at the harsh fluorescent lights humming above the reception desk. The buzzing sound vibrated in her ears. Her right hip throbbed in time with her racing pulse. Her bruised chin ached with every breath. She felt a singular, weak flutter against her left palm. Arthur Jr. moved. He shifted his weight, pressing a tiny limb against the wall of her stomach. He was alive. He was fighting. Maya raised her chin. She stared straight ahead at the blank white wall of the waiting room. She would never shed another tear for Julian Vanguard. She would never accept another counterfeit smile from the man who threw his own unborn child onto frozen concrete. The illusion of the humble maid seeking simple love was dead. The blizzard had frozen that naive girl to death on the St. Regis loading dock. She smoothed the ruined fabric of her dress over her belly. The Sterling bloodline did not beg. The Sterling Empire did not forgive. Her father had bought the Vanguard family their pathetic, gilded existence 20 years ago. Julian thought he was an apex predator discarding a helpless liability to make room for his mistress. He had no idea he had just declared war on the architect of his own survival. She traced the rectangular outline of the thick black card hidden in her pocket. Her hand stopped shaking. Her breathing steadied. The lingering cold in her bones solidified into something sharp, permanent, and unbreakable. She calculated the time difference between Aspen and London. It was approaching dawn across the Atlantic. Her father would be awake. He would be sitting in his leather wingback chair, drinking black coffee, oblivious to the fact that his only daughter was bleeding in a public hospital waiting room. She visualized the private, unlisted numbers memorized in her youth. She imagined the 5 matte black Maybachs sitting idle in a subterranean garage, waiting for a singular command. The triage nurse pushed open the security door. Her rubber-soled shoes squeaked against the freshly mopped linoleum. "Ma'am?" The nurse held a clipboard against her chest. "Do you need a doctor?" Maya did not look at the nurse. She kept her eyes fixed on the blank white wall. She kept her hands over the heir to the Sterling throne. She had no tears left. She chose war. Miles away, her enemy celebrated. Victory felt absolute. The heavy oak double doors of the Vanguard presidential suite clicked shut. The brass deadbolt slid into the steel frame with a solid metallic thud. Julian shrugged off his bespoke charcoal worsted wool jacket. He tossed the $5,000 garment carelessly onto the ivory cashmere sofa. He walked toward the wet bar. The suite occupied the entire top floor of the St. Regis Aspen. The ambient temperature held at a balmy 72 degrees, regulated by a network of hidden digital thermostats. Hand-scraped mahogany floors stretched toward a massive riverstone hearth. A fire of split white birch burned bright and hot, casting flickering orange shadows across the vaulted ceiling. The air inside the room tasted of vintage wealth, burning wood, and intoxicating power. He gripped the neck of a heavy baccarat crystal decanter. The amber liquid inside was a 60-year-old Macallan Scotch. He poured 3 fingers into a wide-rimmed glass. The liquor splashed against the crystal. The sound was sharp. It was the sound of undisputed victory. A dozen heavy gold bangles crashed together. Chloe stepped out of the shadows of the hallway. She kicked off her diamond-encrusted stiletto heels. Her bare feet sank deep into the plush, hand-tufted Persian rug. The crimson satin of her plunging gown dragged behind her over the mahogany floorboards, trailing like a fresh ribbon of blood. She walked straight to the floor-to-ceiling window. Beyond the reinforced glass pane, the aspen blizzard raged in the darkness. The wind clawed at the window frames with an aggressive, guttural howl. Below them, the hotel loading dock was invisible, buried under swirling, chaotic sheets of white ice. "Do you think she made it to the street?" Julian took a slow sip of his scotch. The rare alcohol burned a pleasant, warming trail down his throat. "I do not care." He walked up behind Chloe. He looked out at the blinding snowstorm. He pictured the thin cream silk of Maya's maternity dress clinging to her shivering frame. He pictured her cheap satin flat sliding on the frozen concrete, A low, dark hum of amusement vibrated in his chest. She thought her pathetic little swelling belly would act as a shield. She thought forcing her way into the ballroom tonight would force my hand. Julian swirled the scotch in his glass. The ice clinked. She has no concept of the machinery she is up against. She brought tears to a corporate slaughter. He turned away from the window. He walked toward a massive mahogany writing desk near the fireplace. He ran his hand over the polished wood. He opened the top, brass-handled drawer. He pulled out a thick, unmarked manila envelope. He dropped the envelope onto the glass coffee table. The heavy paper slapped against the glass. The sharp noise echoed through the cavernous suite. He unspooled the red string closure. He spread a dozen legal documents across the table. "Look at this, Chloe. The architectural blueprints of her ruin." Chloe turned from the window. Her heavy gold earrings caught the firelight. She walked toward the table, her hips swaying with a slow, predatory rhythm. He tapped the first stack of heavy parchment. Ex parte divorce filings, drafted by my team in Manhattan 3 weeks ago. They cite irreconcilable differences, severe emotional instability, and a documented pattern of erratic behavior posing an inherent risk to Vanguard Holdings. He tapped the second stack. Asset suppression forms. I moved the Aspen estate, the Tribeca penthouse, and the primary Cayman accounts into a blind offshore trust yesterday morning. On paper, Julian Vanguard is liquidating. On paper, I own nothing but the watch on my wrist. When she goes crawling to a public defender on Monday morning, they will find zero marital assets to divide. He picked up the third document. He held it up to the firelight. And this, the masterpiece. Chloe leaned in. The overpowering scent of her Tom Ford black orchid perfume suffocated the subtle aroma of the burning birchwood. She rested her manicured hands on the back of the cashmere sofa. "A preemptive custody block," Julian stated, "filed in a private family court by a judge who owes his entire career to my grandfather's campaign donations. It declares her financially destitute and psychologically unfit to parent. It revokes all legal access to the Vanguard name. Even if that mongrel in her swollen belly survives the freezing cold tonight, it will never carry my surname. It will never inherit a single dime of my empire." Chloe traced the sharp edge of the legal paper with a ruby-painted fingernail. "You erased her. I sterilized my legacy, so even in Indriasts." Chloe stepped around the sofa. She closed the distance between them. She pressed her palms flat against the center of his chest. Her heavy gold jewelry felt like ice through his thin white dress shirt. "Now build me." Julian narrowed his eyes. "I played my part, Julian." Her voice dropped to a demanding whisper. "I orchestrated the paternity rumors with the tabloids. I bought the silence of the cleaning staff. I paid the private clinic in Denver for the fake sonograms to leak to the press. I stood in front of 400 of your wealthiest investors tonight and played the dutiful mother of your true heir." She slid her hands down to his waist. She gripped his leather belt. "I want a 10% equity stake in Vanguard Holdings. I want it transferred into my name by Monday morning. I want the corner office renamed. And I want the ring." Julian stared down at her upturned face. He loved her unmasked greed. He recognized his own ruthless ambition mirrored in her eyes. Maya had wanted his time. Maya had wanted his affection in empty hotel laundry rooms. Chloe wanted his raw, unchecked power. It was a transaction he respected. 10% is $1 billion, Chloe. And I am carrying your son. She placed her left hand conspicuously over the flat-toned center of her own stomach. She smoothed the crimson satin over her abdomen. A boy of pure pedigree, a boy who will ensure the Vanguard bloodline remains untainted by the lower classes. You owe me. Julian looked at the scattered divorce papers. He looked back at the fierce, demanding woman in front of him. He felt the rush of absolute control. 5%, the ring, and a seat on the executive board. Chloe grinned. Her teeth flashed bright white against her dark red lipstick. Deal. Julian stepped away from her embrace. He walked to the wet bar. He grabbed a green glass bottle of San Pellegrino. He twisted the aluminum cap. The carbonation hissed into the quiet room. He poured the sparkling water into a tall crystal highball glass. He dropped a single wedge of fresh lime into the rising bubbles. He walked back and handed the glass to her. Hydrate. The mountain altitude is rough on the baby. Chloe took the glass. She maintained unbroken eye contact. She nodded slowly. Julian turned his back to her. He walked toward the mahogany desk to retrieve his cell phone. Chloe's smile vanished. She looked down at the sparkling water. Her upper lip curled in profound disgust. She glanced up at Julian's broad back. He was typing his security passcode into his phone screen. She set the water on the edge of the glass coffee table. She reached across the marble top of the wet bar. She grabbed Julian's abandoned crystal glass of 60-year-old Macallan Scotch. She brought the heavy crystal to her lips. She tipped her head back. She swallowed the harsh, burning liquor in one continuous, desperate gulp. Her throat convulsed. She slammed the empty crystal glass back onto its exact wet condensation ring on the marble. She snatched her sparkling water. She took a delicate, measured sip just as Julian turned back around. He held his phone in his right hand. He looked at the scattering of legal documents. You know why I did it tonight, in front of everyone? Chloe shook her head. She feigned innocent curiosity. Because she needed to understand her place. Julian's voice dropped into a low, predatory register. He paced a slow circle around the leather sofa. She thought a gold band on her finger changed her DNA. She thought scrubbing baseboards at the plaza was some noble origin story I would eventually learn to respect. She thought she was my equal. He stopped pacing. He looked out the window into the howling white abyss. Chloe laughed. The sound was high and sharp, scraping against the heavy silence of the luxurious suite. She is freezing by the dumpsters right now. Then the trash is exactly where it belongs. Julian tapped the screen of his phone. He dialed a private New York area code. He held the phone to his ear. The line rang twice. Vance. The voice on the other end was muffled and metallic. File it, Julian ordered. His voice was flat, devoid of any human hesitation. All of it. Trigger the asset freeze immediately. Send the divorce decree to whatever public defender she manages to scrape together. He listened for a brief moment. He rubbed his thumb slowly across his square jawline. I do not care if it is a Sunday morning. Call the judge at his home. Wake him up. Tell him Vanguard Holdings is expanding its real estate portfolio in his district. He walked toward the roaring fireplace. He stared into the flames. And Vance? Call Aspen Valley Medical Center. Call Denver General. Call every private clinic within a 200-mile radius of this mountain. Inform their billing departments that Maya Vanguard is no longer covered under the corporate platinum insurance policy. He watched a birch log snap and crumble into orange embers. If she walks in with frostbite, they can treat her on the taxpayer's dime. Cancel her black cards. Deactivate her phone line. call the building manager at the Tribeca penthouse and have the locks changed by sunrise." He paused, a cruel, triumphant smile stretched across his face. "Burn the nursery furniture. I want that room converted back into a cigar lounge by Tuesday. Erase her." He ended the call. He tossed the phone onto the leather cushions. The legal machine was in motion. The trap was sprung. There was no reversing the avalanche he had just triggered. The erasure of Maya Vanguard was a mathematical certainty. He walked toward the massive gilded mirror hanging above the wet bar. He stared at his own reflection. He saw a titan. He saw a king. He saw the untouchable architect of the Vanguard Empire. The bespoke suit hugged his shoulders with architectural precision. His jaw was set. His eyes were cold and clear. He had excised the weak link from his life with surgical precision. He reached for his crystal Scotch glass. He realized it was empty. He frowned for a fraction of a second, staring at the wet ring on the marble. He did not remember finishing the pour. He shrugged. He grabbed the heavy decanter. He poured another 3 fingers of the rare amber liquid. He raised the glass toward the mirror. The firelight caught the intricate cuts of the baccarat crystal, casting fractured prisms of light across his face. He smiled. He owned the entire world. Dawn broke over the icy peaks. The legal machine accelerated. The Mont Blanc fountain pen scratched against the heavy, watermarked parchment. The sound was sharp. It was rhythmic. It was the sound of a life being dismantled. Julian Vanguard stood at the head of a massive frosted glass conference table. The Aspen branch of Vanguard Holdings occupied the 52nd floor of a monolithic steel and glass tower. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the morning sun broke through the dissipating blizzard, casting harsh, blinding light across the Italian leather chairs. 6 corporate attorneys sat in silence. They wore identical navy Brioni suits. They did not drink the espresso steaming in porcelain cups before them. They waited for Julian to speak. He tapped his platinum Patek Philippe watch against the glass table. Click, click, click. Status. The lead attorney Vance adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. He slid a thick stack of finalized injunctions across the frosted glass. The freeze is executed. The biometrics on the Tribeca penthouse elevator were wiped at dawn. The locks on the Aspen estate have been changed. The Porsche SUV is currently being winched onto a flatbed on 5th Avenue. Julian picked up the top document. He admired the fresh ink. And her liquid capital? Zeroed. The Joint Chase Sapphire is deactivated. The Platinum American Express is locked. We routed her personal savings from the Plaza days into an escrow account under the guise of marital asset review. She cannot buy a cup of coffee. Julian smiled. The victory tasted metallic and sweet. He had turned a human being into a ghost before the sun even cleared the Rocky Mountains. Across town, the ghost still breathed. The hospital offered no comfort. The crinkling sanitary paper of exam room 4 sounded like breaking bones every time Maya shifted her weight. The sterile, aggressive fluorescent lights hummed a relentless, vibrating drone above her head. The hospital smelled of industrial bleach, oxidized copper, and stale vending machine coffee. She pulled the edges of Elias Thorne's oversized cashmere coat tighter across her collarbone. Underneath, her cream silk maternity dress clung to her skin, stiff and sour with dried champagne. She placed both hands flat against the heavy, aching curve of her belly. Arthur Jr. pressed a tiny, distinct heel against her left palm. The movement was sluggish, The freezing cold of the loading dock had taken a toll on her core temperature. A fetal heart monitor strapped across her midsection thumped a steady, rhythmic cadence from a bulky plastic machine beside the bed. Thump, thump, thump. It was the only sound tethering her to sanity. The brushed steel handle of the exam room door clicked. A woman in a Navy hospital administration vest walked in. She carried a bulky gray tablet. She did not look at Maya's face. She looked at the screen. "Mrs. Vanguard, I need an alternate form of payment." Maya tightened her grip on her stomach. Her bruised chin throbbed as she formed the words. "My insurance is on file. The Vanguard Corporate Platinum Policy." The administrator tapped a thick plastic stylus against the glass screen. "The policy administrator revoked your coverage at 4:15 in the morning. We ran your primary credit card. It flagged as stolen. We ran the secondary debit card. Insufficient funds." Maya stared at the woman's sensible, rubber-soled shoes. The room tilted. The air grew thin. Julian was moving with the velocity of a predator smelling blood in the water. He was not just locking her out, he was erasing the ground beneath her feet. "I just need the doctor to read the ultrasound, just to ensure the baby suffered no distress." "Without payment, this is a non-emergency discharge. I need you to vacate the bed." The administrator reached forward. She slid a pair of trauma shears under the plastic admission bracelet on Maya's left wrist. She squeezed the handles. The plastic snapped. The white band fell to the linoleum floor. The door swung open again. The administrator stepped aside. Tessa stood in the doorway. Maya stopped breathing. The air trapped in her lungs turned to broken glass. Tessa wore a tailored Max Mara camel hair coat. Maya recognized the coat. She had purchased it for Tessa last November at Bergdorf Goodman. She had paid cash from her personal savings. Tessa had cried in the dressing room, swearing her eternal loyalty to the only woman who had ever treated her like family. They had scrubbed baseboards together at the Plaza Hotel. Tessa had held Maya's bouquet at the wedding. Tessa was her anchor. Tessa did not look like an anchor today. She looked like a Vanguard employee. She carried a thin, white plastic grocery bag in her right hand. She held a thick manila envelope in her left. Tessa walked to the edge of the exam table. She dropped the plastic bag onto Maya's lap. The thin plastic tore open. A faded, threadbare blue cotton housekeeping uniform spilled out onto the ruined cream silk. The brass name tag pinned to the collar read, "Maya, Housekeeping." Maya stared at the brass letters. Her hands began to shake. "What is this, Tessa?" "Your reality check." The cruelty in Tessa's voice was shocking. It was a flat, rehearsed indifference. She dropped the heavy manila envelope next to the uniform. "Divorce filings, an eviction notice, a permanent restraining order. Julian needs your signature on the bottom line of page 4 to expedite the asset forfeiture." Maya looked up from the brass name tag. She searched Tessa's dark brown eyes for a flicker of hesitation. She searched for the girl who used to split stale blueberry muffins with her in the plaza break room. The girl was gone, replaced by a polished corporate mercenary. "Why?" Maya asked. The word was a raw, scraping whisper. Tessa smoothed the lapel of her expensive camel coat. "You wanted to play the humble, suffering martyr. I wanted to escape the laundry room. Julian offered me the position of executive estate manager. $250,000 a year, stock options, a penthouse allowance. You paid me in hand-me-down clothes and sweet smiles. He pays me in equity." Maya pressed both hands tight against her belly. The betrayal felt physical. It felt like a serrated blade sliding between her ribs, twisting with every word. She curled her shoulders forward, instinctively shielding Arthur Jr. from the toxic, suffocating energy radiating from her former best friend. "I trusted you with my life." Tessa unclipped a gold Mont Blanc pen from her clipboard. She held it out. "Your life is over. Sign the papers." Heavy, measured footsteps echoed in the corridor. Click, click, click. The sound of Italian leather, Oxfords on linoleum paralyzed Maya's spine. Julian stepped into the doorway. He wore the same bespoke charcoal worsted wool suit from the St. Regis ballroom. He looked immaculate. He looked well-rested. He looked like a god inspecting the ashes of a village he had just burned for sport. He placed one hand on the aluminum doorframe. He blocked the only exit. "You are awake." Julian's voice vibrated off the sterile white walls. Maya did not speak. She kept her hands clamped over her stomach. She raised her chin. She stared at his silk necktie. "Tessa tells me you are hesitating. You always did struggle with basic instructions." He stepped into the room. The scent of 60-year-old Macallan Scotch and expensive mint invaded the sterile hospital air. He walked to the side of the exam table. He stood directly over her. He was 6 feet 2 inches of unchecked corporate aggression. He forced her to look up at him. "I wanted to see it." Julian leaned down. His face stopped 3 inches from hers. "I wanted to look at your face when you realized the magnitude of your mistake. You tried to trap me with this child. You tried to force your way into my bloodline." He reached out. He dragged his index finger across the faded blue cotton of the housekeeper uniform resting on her lap. "Look around you. Look at your clothes. Look at your friend. Vanguard Holdings owns the building you are sitting in. I own the judge who drafted those papers. I own the woman standing next to you. You brought nothing into my world and you leave with nothing." He straightened his posture. He buttoned his suit jacket. "You have nothing. You are nothing." Maya's jaw locked. The coppery taste of blood returned to her mouth. She stared through him. She would not scream. Her silence was a fortress he could not breach. Julian sneered. He turned his back on her. He walked out of exam room 4. He stopped in the fluorescent-lit corridor and looked back at the open door of exam room 4. His hand hovered over the brushed steel handle. He did not enter the room. He turned away and followed the woman in the crimson trench coat instead. Tessa watched Julian leave. She looked back at Maya. She tossed the Mont Blanc pen onto the crinkling sanitary paper. "The security guards are coming to escort you off the property in 5 minutes. Take the scrubs." Tessa turned on her heel. She walked out. She shut the door. The heavy click of the latch echoed in the small room. Maya sat alone. The silence was heavy. It pressed against her eardrums. It settled over her bruised shoulders. She looked at the faded blue housekeeping uniform resting on her thighs. She looked at the divorce papers demanding her permanent erasure. His voice echoed in the cavernous space of her memory. "She is a piece of cheap hotel furniture. You use it, you break it, and you leave it by the dumpster." A sharp contraction rippled across her lower abdomen. She gasped. She bent forward. The pain was different this time. It was a localized burning spike near her hip. She breathed through her nose. She rode the wave of agony until it receded into a dull throb. Arthur Jr. needed her to survive this hour. The heavy steel door swung open again. 2 men in dark Vanguard security uniforms stood in the hallway. They did not speak. They pointed toward the exit signs at the end of the corridor. Maya slid off the exam table. Her bare feet hit the cold linoleum. The shock sent a shiver up her spine. She ignored the faded blue scrubs. She ignored the Mont Blanc pen. She left the manila envelope resting on the sanitary paper. She walked past the guards. She kept her chin raised. She maintained the slow, heavy grace of her ruined posture. She navigated the labyrinth of white hallways, moving toward the rear exit of the hospital. She pushed through the glass double doors. The storm had broken. The morning sun glared off the fresh snowbanks, blinding and cruel. A wooden transit bench sat buried under 3 inches of powder next to the icy road. She walked to it. She swept the snow away with her bruised forearm. She sat down. The cold immediately attacked her bare legs. She pulled Elias Thorne's oversized cashmere coat tight around her belly. She watched a snowplow scrape against the asphalt 2 blocks away. She had no home. She had no husband. She had no friend. She reached into the hidden pocket of her stiff, champagne-soaked silk dress. Her frozen fingers found the rigid edge. She pulled it out into the harsh sunlight. The thick, unmarked black card felt heavy in her palm. The embossed gold numbers caught the morning light. She stared at the card. She had nothing left to lose. She dialed the 10 numbers. The line clicked open on the 2nd ring. A voice spoke, not a greeting. A secure, automated chime followed by a crisp, metallic hum. Maya parted her lips to speak. A localized earthquake tore through her lower spine. The phone slipped from her numb, plum-colored fingers. It struck the icy asphalt. The screen splintered into a web of sharp glass. Maya gripped the armrest of the frozen transit bench. The wood was slick with frost. Her knuckles ached with the effort. The dull throb in her pelvis magnified into a white-hot serrated blade. The impact on the St. Regis loading dock had done its silent, catastrophic work. A warm, wet rush soaked the inside of her thighs. The amniotic fluid melted the snow pooling beneath her ruined satin flats. It carried the metallic, terrifying scent of fresh blood. It dripped off the edge of the bench, staining the pristine white snow below with streaks of crimson. She pressed both palms flat against her belly. Her frozen fingers offered no comfort. Arthur Jr. was sinking. The pressure against her pelvic bone was immense. The child fought a failing fortress. He kicked against the contracting uterine wall. He demanded oxygen. He demanded heat. She needed to stand. Her knees gave out. She slumped sideways against the frozen wooden slats. The glass double doors of the emergency room blew open. A woman rushed into the blinding aspen sunlight. She wore pristine white scrubs and a heavy navy blue trauma jacket. A silver stethoscope swung against her collarbone. She did not look like the administrator. She had sharp, assessing eyes set in rich mahogany skin. "Nurse Clara!" She bypassed the snow-covered sidewalk. She stepped into the icy slush. She knelt in the puddle of freezing amniotic fluid. She saw the shattered phone. She saw the unmarked black card resting on the bench. She scooped the thick cardstock into her pocket. "I have you." The rolling gurney rattled over the linoleum. Click-clack, click-clack. The harsh fluorescent lights strobed above Maya's face in a nauseating rhythm. The hospital smelled of floor wax and rubbing alcohol. The cruel administrator from exam room 4 stepped out from behind the plexiglass triage desk. She held up her thick plastic stylus. "That account is locked." Vanguard Holdings flagged her. "Praba." Nurse Clara shoved the rolling gurney straight past the desk. The metal rail clipped the administrator's hip. The woman stumbled back. Override protocol, Sterling. The administrator's jaw dropped. The word hung in the sterile air. Maya squeezes her eyes shut. She tightened her hands over the contracting mound of her stomach. The pain blinded her. Surgical Theater B was a freezing stainless steel vault. The scent of yellow betadine replaced the smell of oxidized copper. A surgical mask covered Nurse Clara's face. She swabbed the freezing dark brown skin of Maya's swollen belly with a massive foam sponge. The antiseptic was ice cold. The spinal block needle pierced the lumbar region of Maya's spine. A heavy chemical warmth flooded her lower extremities. The agonizing contractions dulled to immense, terrifying pressure. A blue, sterile drape formed a wall at her collarbone. She stared at the porous white ceiling tiles. She traced the geometric patterns with her eyes. She did not scream. She gritted her teeth until her jaw popped. Pressure. The scalpel parted her flesh. Maya felt the aggressive, forceful tugging inside her abdomen. The surgeon leaned his weight into her ribs. She gripped the steel side rails of the operating table. Her knuckles turned the color of old ash. She held her breath. She waited for the sound. 10 seconds passed. The metallic clatter of surgical clamps echoed against the tile walls. The silence stretched. It pulled tight. It threatened to snap her sanity in half. Then, a sharp, angry wail pierced the room. The sound was wet and furious. It was the battle cry of a 5-pound survivor pulled from a freezing, hostile womb. Nurse Clara lowered the drape. Maya saw him. Arthur Jr. was a tiny, thrashing warrior. A thick coating of white vernix clung to his dark, bruised skin. He smelled of raw iron, sterile gauze, and warm life. He kicked his spindly legs against the cold air of the operating room. He possessed the exact curve of his mother's determined chin. His tiny chest heaved with every furious breath. Nurse Clara pulled a faded, striped cotton blanket tight around him. She bypassed the warming incubator. She placed the heavy, squirming bundle onto Maya's bare chest. The heat of his tiny body radiated through her freezing collarbone. Maya exhaled. The fortress walls of her silence cracked. A single hot tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a path through the dried champagne and sweat. She buried her face in his damp, dark hair. The elevator doors pinged on the 4th floor. Chloe DuPont stepped onto the maternity ward. She wore a floor-length scarlet fur coat. The crimson pelt clashed with the pastel blue walls and framed watercolor animals. A dozen heavy gold bangles crashed together as she waved a manicured hand in front of her nose. This entire floor smells like cheap disinfectant and desperation. Julian walked a half-step behind her. His bespoke charcoal worsted wool suit absorbed the harsh fluorescent lighting. His phone had buzzed during his 3rd scotch at the St. Regis. An unauthorized billing override, a ghost account bypassing his freeze at Aspen Valley Medical. He marched up to the central nursing station. He slammed his palm flat against the laminate counter. Who authorized the override? This hospital operates on Vanguard land. We lease this building to the county. I locked that woman's account at dawn. You will unplug whatever machines you have her hooked up to, and you will wheel her to the curb, or I will buy this facility by noon and fire every single person in this ward. Nobody bypasses my authority. Nobody steals from my legacy. Chloe stopped walking. She leaned against the wall. She tapped her ruby-painted fingernails against her leather handbag. You handle the paperwork, Julian. The lighting in here is dreadful for my skin. I am going back to the town car. She turned on her stilettos. The red fur swept across the linoleum. She left him standing alone among the quiet hum of the infant incubators. Julian Vanguard stood outside the heavy wooden door of room 412. He looked through the small pane of reinforced glass. He saw her holding the newborn wrapped in a standard striped hospital blanket. He turned away when Chloe called his name from the corridor. The footsteps faded down the hall. Click, click, click. The heavy fire doors sealed shut. The maternity ward returned to a muffled, continuous quiet. Maya lay propped up on 3 thin hospital pillows. The epidural was wearing off. The fresh surgical incision burned like a line of crushed glass across her lower abdomen. She ignored the pain. She adjusted her arms around the sleeping weight of Arthur Jr. The child breathed in rapid flutters. His miniature fingers curled into tight fists against her collarbone. He was alive. He was hers. He was safe from the ice. She stared out the small window of the recovery room. The morning sun illuminated the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Aspen mountainside. Julian had come. He had looked through the glass. He had walked away. He chose the woman in red. He chose the illusion. He chose the empire built on her father's secret gold. The crushing weight of his betrayal settled into the marrow of her bones. She pulled the striped cotton blanket higher over her son's tiny shoulders. She pressed a gentle kiss to his warm forehead. Her tears dried against her skin. The sorrow evaporated. The vulnerability vanished. A hardened, permanent armor forged itself around her heart. The Sterling Empire operated in silence. The Sterling bloodline did not tolerate treason. She had survived the freezing concrete. She had survived the scalpel. She would survive the war. She looked at the sleeping face of her son. Her eyes were dry, her breathing slowed. She held the future in silence. The fluorescent lights of room 412 hummed a low, synthetic pitch. The sound vibrated against the thin plaster walls. Snow lashed against the single pane of reinforced glass, overlooking the Aspen mountainside. The wind hammered the building. It sounded like jagged fingernails scraping across frozen iron. Maya lay motionless on the stiff mechanical mattress. The sterile, starchy smell of freshly laundered hospital sheets stung her nostrils, masking the lingering metallic scent of her own blood. Arthur Jr. slept against the bare, rich brown skin of her chest. He felt impossibly small. He was a fragile anchor tethering her to the physical world. A faded, striped cotton blanket covered his back. His tiny, bruised hands curled into tight fists against her collarbone. His chest rose. His chest fell. The rhythm was quick, stuttering, and desperate. He smelled of warm milk, surgical iodine, and surviving trauma. Maya rested her chin against the soft, downy hair at the crown of his head. The epidural had worn off hours ago. A white-hot line of crushed glass burned across her lower abdomen with every shallow breath she took. She welcomed the pain. The pain meant she was alive. The pain meant Julian had failed to bury her in the snow. A gray plastic hospital telephone sat on the rolling overbed tray. The coiled cord hung over the edge, swaying slightly in the draft from the air vent. Next to the plastic base sat the thick, unmarked black card. Nurse Clara had placed it there after wiping the freezing amniotic fluid from the floor. She had asked no questions. She had bypassed the Vanguard corporate blockade. The embossed gold digits stamped into the heavy cardstock caught the amber glow of the street lamp filtering through the drawn plastic blinds. 10 numbers. They represented a world Maya had buried beneath a mountain of lies. She stared at the gold numbers. Her hands trembled. 3 years ago, She had stood in a cavernous, mahogany-paneled library in London. The air had tasted of aged scotch, burning peat, and centuries of inherited ruthless ambition. Rain had hammered the towering stained-glass windows overlooking the Thames. A massive antique grandfather clock had ticked in the corner, counting the seconds of her treason. She had worn a simple gray wool coat. She had carried a single leather duffel bag. A man had sat behind a massive desk carved from solid oak. He had worn a tailored dark suit. He had not looked up from his ledger. He had not begged her to stay. He had simply let her walk. She had walked away from the throne. She had chosen the brutal, calloused hands of a hotel maid over the crushing, claustrophobic weight of a billionaire's legacy. She had traded a fortress of private military protection for Julian Vanguard's whispered promises in a damp plaza laundry room. She wanted a man to look at her bare face and see a woman, not a trust fund. She wanted love built on sweat, not extortion. She chose love over blood. She was a fool. The illusion had frozen to death on the St. Regis loading dock. The man she loved had tossed her onto the icy concrete to make room for a crimson dress and a fabricated heir. He had stripped her of her coat. He had stripped her of her dignity. He had attempted to strip her of her child. Maya shifted her weight on the stiff mattress. The surgical staples across her pelvic line pulled tight. A jagged spike of agony shot up her spine. She ground her teeth together. A low groan vibrated in the back of her throat. She pressed her forearm against the mattress and pushed her torso upward. The mechanical bed whined under the sudden movement. Arthur Jr. stirred against her collarbone. He let out a tiny, breathless squeak. Maya stopped moving. She waited for the infant to settle back into a heavy sleep. She reached her right hand toward the overbed tray. Her dark, plum-colored fingers remained swollen from the frostbite. The knuckles throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. She dragged her hand across the cracked plastic surface of the tray. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the black card. The cardstock was cold. It felt heavier than it should. It held the gravity of a collapsing star. It was a direct line to the architect of the global shadow economy. She picked it up. She traced the raised gold numbers with her bruised thumb. The edges of the card were sharp. She dropped the card onto the bedsheets. She grabbed the gray plastic telephone receiver. The plastic felt cheap and hollow. She lifted it from the cradle. A loud, continuous dial tone blasted into her ear. The synthetic noise pierced the quiet room. She dragged the coiled cord across her lap. She rested the receiver against her shoulder. She typed the international exit code into the sticky rubber keypad. She paused. The wind howled against the windowpane. The shadows in the corners of the hospital room seemed to lengthen. A suffocating wave of shame washed over her. She had failed. She had abandoned her family for a monster. She had nearly killed the next heir to the Sterling bloodline out of sheer stubborn pride. She closed her eyes. Julian's voice scraped against the inside of her skull. The memory did not break her this time. The cruelty did not summon a single tear. It acted as a whetstone. It sharpened the raw, jagged edges of her fractured soul. The shame evaporated. The hesitation vanished. She opened her eyes. They were hard, cold, and clear. She punched the 10 gold numbers into the keypad. The dial tone cut out. A series of electronic clicks echoed down the line. Transatlantic static hissed against her ear. It was a hollow, expansive sound. It traveled across an ocean, down through subterranean fiber optic cables, bypassing global security firewalls, and connecting to a desk that did not exist on any public registry. It gave the darkness time to speak. The line connected. There was no ringing. There was no automated greeting. The static simply shifted into a dense, heavy silence. A man breathed on the other end. He did not say hello. He did not demand identification. He waited. The silence carried the weight of 100 private armies. It carried the unspoken authority of a man who manipulated global markets before his morning coffee. Maya envisioned him sitting in the exact same leather wingback chair she had left him in. She pictured the rain still beating against the London glass, a perpetual storm mirroring the one raging outside her own hospital window. The distance between them was geographical, but the emotional chasm was a universe-wide. She had to cross it. She had to build the bridge. Maya swallowed the dry, metallic taste in her mouth. "Dad!" The word shattered the quiet of the hospital room. It felt foreign on her tongue. It felt like wielding a loaded weapon. The static crackled. The breathing on the other end stopped. "It's me." The silence stretched. It pulled tight across the miles. It held 20 years of compounding debt. It held 3 years of unanswered letters and unreturned silence. Maya pulled the striped hospital blanket tighter around the sleeping newborn. "I need you." A sharp exhale vibrated through the plastic speaker. The sound was thick with raw, ancient power. The timbre of the breath alone could shatter glass. "I never stopped watching over you." The voice was gravel and cold steel. It held no anger. It held no disappointment. It held the terrifying, absolute certainty of an apex predator waking from a long slumber. Maya pressed her hand against her baby's warm back. "I have a son." The pause on the line lasted a fraction of a second. The atmospheric pressure in the room seemed to drop. The game had fundamentally changed. It was no longer just the recovery of a runaway daughter. It was the survival of a dynasty. "Send me the address. Aspen Valley Medical." The man on the other end did not ask for details. He did not ask for a name. He did not ask why she was calling from a public hospital ward in the middle of a blizzard. "The sky will fall on them by morning." The line went dead. The flat signal buzzed. Maya pulled the receiver away from her face, staring at the cheap gray plastic in her trembling hand. She placed the handset back onto its cradle. The plastic clicked. The sound was final. The avalanche had started. There was no retreating from the summit. She looked down. Arthur Jr. shifted against her ribs. He opened his eyes. They were dark, assessing, and unblinking. He did not cry. He stared up at his mother with a profound, terrifying stillness. He possessed the same unreadable, calculating gaze as the man she had just spoken to. His tiny chest expanded. His miniature fingers uncurled from their tight fists, reaching blindly in the dim light. He grasped the edge of the striped hospital blanket. He held on with surprising strength. He was a survivor. He was a sterling. Maya touched his tiny, bruised cheek. Her thumb grazed his warm skin. The corners of her mouth twitched. The frozen, rigid muscles of her face fought a long-forgotten instinct. She almost smiled. The suffocating fear of the loading dock was gone. The terror of the freezing concrete was a distant memory. Julian believed he had erased her from the earth. He believed he had severed her from humanity. He did not know he had just handed her the launch codes to his own destruction. The war was no longer hers to fight alone. The shadows were coming for Vanguard Holdings. The digital clock on the wall blinked the time in glaring red numbers. 3:14 in the morning. The hospital ward outside her door was dead quiet. The nurses had completed their rounds. The squeaking of rubber-soled shoes had faded. Only the low hum of the ventilation system remained. Maya leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows. She pulled Arthur Jr. closer to her chin. She listened to the hum of the building. A shadow blocked the sliver of light under the heavy wooden door. Heavy footsteps echoed in the linoleum corridor. Click, 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 the sound of expensive Italian leather Oxfords. The rhythm was slow. The pacing was deliberate. The footsteps bypassed exam room 1. They bypassed exam room 2. They carried a familiar, predatory weight. Maya's heart slammed against her ribs. She placed her hand over the baby's ear. The footsteps stopped. They stood directly outside room 412. The shadow beneath the door remained motionless. The brass handle turned. The brass latch clicked. The heavy wooden door of room 412 swung inward. Julian Vanguard stepped into the dim hospital lighting. He carried a fresh manila envelope. His bespoke charcoal worsted wool suit showed 0 wrinkles. He looked at the stark, unadorned walls. He looked at the mechanical bed. He looked at the tiny, striped cotton bundle resting against Maya's bare chest. He sneered. He paced to the foot of the bed. His Italian leather Oxford squeaked against the wet linoleum. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The hospital smelled of cheap industrial bleach and oxidized copper. It was an offensive odor for a man accustomed to the aroma of burning birch wood and 60-year-old scotch. I expected to find you packing your stolen scrubs. Instead, you are sitting here nursing a liability. Julian walked around the rolling tray. He ran his hand over the cheap plastic. Tessa called me. She told me you left the divorce papers sitting on the exam table. You always were stubborn. It doesn't matter. Tessa is moving her belongings into the Aspen Estate guest house right now. She earned her place. You forfeited yours. Maya held Arthur Jr. closer to her collarbone. The infant's dark, bruised face rested against the rich brown skin of her chest. His tiny, paper-thin fingernails dug into her hospital gown. She traced the soft curve of his ear. She did not look at Julian. She stared at the frost forming on the window pane. The hospital administrator called me, Julian said. Someone bypassed the Vanguard billing freeze. A glitch in the system. I came to correct the error. The eviction stands, Maya. The restraining order stands. He tapped the manila envelope against the metal footboard. The sharp slapping sound echoed over the low hum of the ventilation system. You have 10 minutes to carry that mongrel out to the transit bench before my security throws you both into the snowbank. Do you understand? Maya shifted her weight on the stiff mattress. The surgical staples across her empty belly pulled tight. A white-hot spike of agony radiated through her pelvic bone. She ignored the pain. She breathed in through her nose. She exhaled a long, measured breath through parted lips. She curled her arms around her newborn son. Arthur Jr. stirred. He let out a soft, rhythmic exhale. He felt the tension radiating from his mother's chest. Maya smoothed the striped cotton blanket over his tiny, fragile back. She raised her chin. She met Julian's gaze. She offered nothing. No tears, no begging, no fear. Her silence was a fortress. Julian hated her silence. He wanted her screaming. He wanted her clawing at his expensive lapels, trading her dignity for a fraction of his wealth. He reached his hand out to rip the medical chart from the end of the bed. A low, rhythmic thumping vibrated through the floorboards. Thwack! 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 The single pane of reinforced glass rattled in its aluminum frame. The water in Maya's plastic bedside cup trembled. Small ripples formed on the surface. The noise grew louder. It escalated into a mechanical roar, chewing through the howling aspen wind. A blinding white searchlight swept across the snow-capped mountainside. The beam hit the hospital window. It flooded room 412 with the intensity of a dying sun. It illuminated the sterile white walls. It cast long, distorted shadows of the medical equipment across the linoleum. It turned Julian's bespoke suit from charcoal to ash in the blinding glare. Julian raised his forearm across his eyes. He stumbled backward. A sleek, matte black helicopter hovered 3 stories above the frozen asphalt. The downdraft ripped the accumulated snow from the hospital roof, creating a blinding, chaotic blizzard against the glass. The sheer vibration of the rotor blades shook the dust from the porous ceiling tiles. Down on the street, 5 matte black Maybachs breached the emergency room loading zone. They drove straight over the concrete curbs. They boxed in the local ambulances. The heavy armored doors swung open in unison. Julian lowered his arm. The vein along his temple throbbed. "What the hell is this?" He turned toward the hallway. The heavy fire doors at the end of the maternity ward slammed open. The crash echoed over the hum of the infant incubators. 12 men marched down the linoleum corridor. They wore identical midnight blue tailored suits. They wore discreet earpieces. They moved with the synchronized, lethal precision of a private military contractor unit. They did not speak. 2 men grabbed the Vanguard security guards stationed by the vending machines. They disarmed the guards in 3 seconds. They forced them to their knees. The remaining contractors fanned out. They secured every stairwell. They locked down every elevator bank. They blocked every exit. The lead contractor reached room 412. He shoved Julian backward. Julian hit the plaster wall. The fresh manila envelope slipped from his grip. The legal divorce papers scattered across the floor, littering the wet linoleum. "Do you know who I am?" Julian spat. He straightened his charcoal lapels. "I own this hospital. I will have you all arrested for assault." The contractor ignored him. He stepped aside. Arthur Sterling walked into the room. The founder of Sterling Global wore a 3-piece charcoal vicuña wool suit. A heavy platinum Patek Philippe watch rested on his left wrist. His silver hair was cropped close to his scalp. His dark brown skin bore the weathered lines of a man who had built a trillion-dollar empire through raw, unyielding force. He carried a silver-tipped walking stick crafted from solid ebony. He did not use it for balance, he carried it as a scepter. He stopped at the foot of the bed. Eee! The room went dead quiet. The helicopter outside maintained its aggressive hover. The threat hung heavy in the freezing air. Arthur looked at Maya. Maya looked at her father. 3 years of silence hung in the sterile room. 3 years of unanswered transatlantic calls. 3 years of scrubbing baseboards, hiding her lineage, and pressing Julian's shirts in a damp laundry room. She had traded a fortress of private military protection for a fleeting illusion of simple love. Arthur's gaze dropped to the striped hospital blanket. He saw the dark, bruised face of Arthur Jr. He saw the tiny, rhythmic rise and fall of his grandson's chest. The corners of Arthur's eyes crinkled. The tension in his broad shoulders melted for a fraction of a second. He saw the future of the Sterling dynasty resting on a cheap mechanical mattress. Maya tilted her chin up. Arthur nodded once. Forgiveness required no words. Arthur turned his head. He looked at Julian. The warmth vanished from his face. The temperature in the room plummeted. The apex predator locked onto his prey. "Secure the floor," Arthur commanded. The contractors moved. 3 men produced rugged, encrypted laptops from tactical briefcases. They set them down on the rolling overbed tray. They pushed the plastic water cup aside. Their fingers hammered the keys. The glowing screens illuminated the dark corners of the hospital room. Lines of code, offshore banking routes, and corporate takeover protocols scroll down the monitors in endless green columns. "What is this theatrical nonsense?" Julian barked. He took a step toward the bed. "Maya, tell your hired thugs to stand down. You think a flashy entrance changes the custody filings? You think renting a helicopter scares Vanguard Holdings?" Arthur planted the tip of his ebony cane against the linoleum. "Execute." The lead contractor tapped his earpiece. His eyes scanned the scrolling data. London is awake. The Vanguard offshore trusts in the Cayman Islands are frozen. Routing transit numbers 044 through 098 are locked. The primary liquidity accounts at Chase are drained. We are initiating the hostile takeover of Vanguard Holdings public shares. Shorting begins at the opening bell. The Vanguard name is being stripped from the Aspen Tower right now. A maintenance crew is unbolting the brass letters from the lobby. Julian laughed. The sound was high, sharp, and dripping with arrogant disbelief. "You are insane. My assets are shielded behind 3 layers of blind trusts. Nobody touches Vanguard money without my biometric signature." Arthur reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a heavy, watermarked parchment ledger. He tossed it onto the mechanical bed. The book landed next to Maya's freezing feet. "Look at the cover, Mr. Vanguard." Julian sneered. He took a hesitant step forward. He read the gold-embossed lettering. "Sterling Global Liquidity. Vanguard Debt Instrument 2006. Julian frowned. The muscles in his jaw locked. Sterling Global is a myth, a ghost corporation. They do not operate in public markets. "We operate where I say we operate," Arthur said. His voice was gravel and cold steel. 20 years ago, your father sat weeping in my London office. He begged for a lifeline. He mortgaged the Vanguard name, the Vanguard real estate, and the Vanguard legacy to me. I wired $500 million to save your pathetic family from liquidation. The debt compounded at 8% annually in the dark. You owe me $1.2 billion. The note is due." Julian shook his head. He looked at Maya. He looked back at Arthur. He pointed a trembling finger at the silver-haired titan. "You are a liar. My grandfather built Vanguard. We owe nothing." Arthur checked his platinum watch. "Call your CFO." Julian grabbed his phone from his trouser pocket. He dialed. He pressed the speaker icon. The line rang once. A frantic voice filled the room. "Julian, Jesus Christ, Julian, where are you? The servers are locked. The Vanguard proprietary trading algorithms are being dismantled. The Cayman banks just triggered a massive margin call on our debt obligations. The entire portfolio is evaporating." Julian stared at the phone. His thumb hovered over the glass screen. "Stop the bleed, Marcus. Liquidate the tech sector shares." "I can't. The shares are gone." They triggered a default clause from a 2006 master loan agreement. "Julian," someone called the debt. "We are bankrupt. We are less than bankrupt. They are seizing the Aspen estate right now. The feds are walking into the lobby." The phone slipped. It hit the linoleum floor. The screen cracked. The CFO's panicked voice continued to scream from the broken speaker. Julian's chest heaved. The bespoke charcoal worsted wool suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his frame. His Italian leather Oxfords remained glued to the floor. He looked at the silver-haired titan leaning on the ebony cane. He looked at the 12 armed men dismantling his empire via keystrokes. He looked at Maya. Maya sat upright against the stiff hospital pillows. Her cream silk maternity dress was ruined, stiff with dried champagne and amniotic fluid. Her dark skin was bruised and battered. She held Arthur Jr. with the fierce, protective grace of a monarch shielding the crown prince. The infant shifted, pressing his tiny fists against her collarbone. "Who are you?" Julian whispered. Arthur stepped forward. He closed the distance. He towered over Julian. "She is Maya Sterling, sole heir to the Sterling global empire." Julian's mouth opened. No sound came out. The air left his lungs. Arthur leaned in. The scent of aged scotch and burning peat suffocated Julian's expensive mint breath. "My daughter never needed your money. She was testing your character. You failed." The words struck Julian like physical blows. The color drained from his face. His square jaw went slack. The realization crawled up his spine, a freezing, parasitic terror. The maid he had mocked. The woman he had shoved onto the icy concrete of the St. Regis loading dock. The liability he had tried to erase. She owned him. She owned his building. She owned his legacy. He had kicked the owner of the board out into the snow. Arthur turned to the contractor at the laptop. "The mistress, Chloe DuPont." "Located, sir," the contractor replied. "She is sitting in Vanguard Town Car 4, idling outside the hospital pharmacy. We have accessed her personal medical records from the Denver clinic. We intercepted a $500,000 wire transfer to a private nurse. The pregnancy is fabricated. The ultrasound photos were purchased from a third-party vendor on November 14th. Julian's head snapped up. His eyes widened. The shock paralyzed his nervous system. "What?" "Your fake heir," Arthur said. "Your crimson-wearing parasite deceived you to secure equity. She played your own greed against you. You threw my pregnant daughter into a sub-zero blizzard for a phantom. You betrayed your bloodline for a lie." Julian stumbled backward. His heel caught the edge of a scattered divorce document. He caught his balance. He stared at the cracked phone on the floor. He stared at the pristine ledger resting on the bed. He turned his desperate gaze to the mechanical mattress. Maya stroked Arthur Jr.'s thick, dark hair. The baby opened his eyes. He looked toward the loud noises. He did not cry. He possessed the same cold, assessing stare as his grandfather. Maya rested her hand flat against her recovering belly, feeling the phantom ache of the child she had fought so hard to protect. She pulled the striped blanket higher over her son's tiny shoulders. Julian took a step toward her. His hands shook. "Maya, please. I didn't know." Maya's jaw hardened. She tightened her grip on her son. "You knew the exact pain you were inflicting. You just didn't know who you were doing it to." Arthur stepped between them. He blocked Julian's view of the bed. He raised his ebony cane. He aimed the silver tip directly at Julian's chest. 20 years ago, my money bought this family's survival. Tonight, it buys your absolute ruin." Julian backed away. His chest rose and fell in rapid, panicked spasms. The arrogant titan of the St. Regis ballroom was dead. A hollow, terrified man stood in his place. He looked at the shattered phone on the floor. He looked at the scattered divorce filings. He looked at the blinding helicopter searchlight illuminating his total destruction. The 12 men in tailored suits watched him bleed invisible blood. The empire he built was a sandcastle standing in front of a tsunami, and the wave had just crashed. He had no money, he had no legacy, he had no name. He stood frozen. The floor was gone. Morning brought brutal clarity. The battlefield shifted. The grand baccarat chandelier of the St. Regis Aspen hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting fractured prisms of morning light across the cavernous ballroom. The orchestra was gone. The grand piano sat abandoned in the corner. The polished ebony lid shut tight against the silence. The massive swan-eye sculpture dominated the center of the room. It was half melted now, losing the sharp, arrogant edges of its wings. A steady, rhythmic drip of water fell from the ruined crystal beak, splashing onto the hand-tufted Persian rugs. Drip, 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 drip. The floor remained a graveyard of the previous night's cruelty. The jagged shards of the shattered champagne flute still rested near the mahogany tasting bar. The sticky, dark outline of the vintage Dom Perignon soaked deep into the marble floor. It marked the exact spot where Maya had stood in her ruined cream silk maternity dress. 400 of America's wealthiest titans occupied the room. They had fled the blizzard at midnight. They returned at dawn under the threat of absolute financial ruin. Arthur Sterling had summoned them back with a single, unlisted mass email. They did not wear tuxedos and plunging gowns. They wore subdued morning suits. They wore thick cashmere overcoats over hastily buttoned dress shirts. They stood in suffocating silence. The air tasted of stale yeast, melting ice, and raw, unrestrained fear. The flashbulbs of a dozen press photographers strobed in the periphery, casting blinding white shadows against the mahogany walls. The media had arrived to document a corporate funeral. They captured every bead of sweat on Julian's forehead. The heavy brass doors swung open. 5 matte black Maybachs idled in the emergency loading dock outside the floor-to-ceiling glass wall. 12 elite private security contractors marched into the ballroom. They wore tailored midnight blue suits. They formed an impenetrable perimeter around the exit doors. They locked the brass deadbolts. Arthur Sterling entered. The founder of Sterling Global carried his silver-tipped ebony cane. He wore the 3-piece charcoal vicuña wool suit. He possessed the gravity of a collapsing star. Every billionaire in the room stopped breathing. The flashes from the press cameras ceased instantly. Nobody dared to photograph the architect of the shadow economy without his direct permission. Maya Sterling walked beside him. She wore a pristine cream cashmere long coat over a white silk day dress. The heavy fabric shielded her battered, shivering frame from the lingering mountain chill. She did not walk with the hurried, frantic steps of a fleeing maid. She walked with the slow, measured grace of a queen ascending her rightful throne. Her right hip throbbed from the impact on the freezing concrete. She maintained a flawless, rigid posture. She carried a bundle of fresh cream wool against her chest. Arthur Jr. weighed barely 5 pounds. His tiny, bruised hands curled into tight fists against his mother's collarbone, seeking the steady, familiar rhythm of her heartbeat. His dark skin smelled of sterile gauze, warm milk, and Johnson's baby soap. Maya rested her right palm lightly over her recovering belly. The hollow ache of the surgical incision remained, a sharp reminder of the scalpel tearing through her flesh to save the Sterling bloodline. She masked the pain. The phantom weight of her pregnancy was gone, replaced by the living, breathing anchor resting against her heart. Julian Vanguard stood in the center of the ballroom. He occupied the exact spot where he had tossed the crisp $100 bills. His bespoke charcoal worsted wool suit was ruined. The lapels were creased. The collar was sweat-stained. The unchecked corporate aggression had evaporated from his square jaw. His Italian leather Oxfords looked scuffed and dull. Chloe DuPont stood 3 feet away from him. "Ma!" She wore a knee-length crimson wool dress. The heavy gold bangles hung on her wrists, clanking together with her nervous tremors. She clutched a leather handbag against her stomach. Her crimson lipstick formed a harsh, uneven line. She glanced frantically at the locked brass doors. Beatrice Vanguard leaned heavily on her diamond-encrusted silver cane near the mahogany bar. The silver mink coat draped over her shoulders looked damp and heavy. She stared at the marble floor, refusing to look at Maya. Arthur Sterling stopped at the edge of the champagne stain. He tapped the ebony cane against the marble floor. Click, click. A massive projection screen descended from the vaulted ceiling above the tasting bar. The mechanical whirring of the motor cut through the heavy silence. The screen dwarfed the room. Arthur gestured to a high-backed velvet chair positioned away from the cold drafts. Maya sat down. She adjusted the cream wool blanket over Arthur Jr. The infant shifted, pressing his tiny heel into her ribcage. She held him tight. She rested her chin parallel to the marble floor. Elias Thorne stepped out from the shadows of the mahogany bar. The head sommelier wore his crisp black tuxedo. The tiny matte black lapel pin on his collar was gone. He held a silver remote control in his left hand. He held a thick, leather-bound folio in his right. He walked with the silent, calculating steps of a man who controlled the room's oxygen supply. Elias pressed a button on the silver remote. The ballroom lights dimmed. The massive screen flickered to life. The digital video from Elias's lapel camera illuminated the room. The high-resolution audio fed through the massive concert speakers hidden in the walls. Julian's voice boomed from the digital speakers. "Look at this pathetic, clinging parasite trying to play the billionaire's wife." The crowd watched the digital version of Julian pace a slow circle around the pregnant maid. They watched the cruel sneer on his face. They watched the casual flick of his wrist as he threw the severance money at her collarbone. They saw Maya standing statuesque, her hands pressed flat against her swollen belly. The camera angle shifted. It tracked the aggressive march down the center aisle to the brass exit doors. The screen showed the blizzard raging outside. The wind howled through the speakers, a guttural roar echoing across the ballroom. The footage showed Julian placing his hands on Maya's shoulders. "Goodbye, Maya. Enjoy the snow." The digital shove landed with devastating force. The screen captured Maya's cream flat skidding on the frozen concrete. It captured the exact moment her ankle twisted. It captured her twisting her torso mid-air, throwing her center of gravity to the side to protect the unborn child. It captured the heavy oak doors slamming shut, the brass deadbolt sliding into place, sealing her in the freezing dark. The video faded to black. The ballroom lights brightened. 400 investors stared at Julian Vanguard. The disgust in the room was palpable. It felt like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. The socialites who had laughed the night before now stared at the floor. Elias stepped to the center of the champagne-stained marble. He opened the heavy brass clasp of his leather folio. He smoothed the thick parchment pages with his gloved thumb. He did not look at Julian. He looked at the vast crowd of silent titans. "Timestamp, 11:58, at night," Elias read. His voice carried zero inflection. It held only the chilling, precise weight of a coroner reading a cause of death. He turned the page. The rustle of paper echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "She is a piece of cheap hotel furniture. You use it, you break it, and you leave it by the dumpster." Second one passed. The ballroom smelled of stagnant vintage champagne and melting ice. Second two passed. Elias closed the leather folio with a soft, final snap. Second three passed. Julian forgot to exhale, his chest locked rigid beneath his ruined charcoal jacket. Maya adjusted the cream wool blanket around her son. She raised her chin. She stared directly into Julian's bloodshot eyes. "Tell me, who has nothing now?" Julian opened his mouth. His jaw trembled. No sound came out. The vein along his temple throbbed against his pale skin. Arthur Sterling tapped his cane again. Click. Elias pressed the silver remote. The massive screen flickered. The resolution shifted from the aspen blizzard to the harsh fluorescent lighting of a Denver private clinic. The footage carried a security camera timestamp from November. Chloe sat on a paper-lined exam table. She wore a crimson silk blouse. A nurse in blue scrubs handed her a printed sonogram. Chloe handed the nurse a thick stack of banded $100 bills. The audio crackled, then cleared. The sound of a counting machine shuffling the paper money filled the silent ballroom. "Make sure the dates align with the Vanguard New Year's gala," Chloe's digital voice echoed through the room. "Julian needs a reason to pull the trigger." The video froze on Chloe's face. The massive screen highlighted the greedy, triumphant smirk on her painted lips. A woman stepped out from the crowd of investors. She wore a tailored navy suit. She carried a leather medical bag. "I am Dr. Eris Evans, Chief of Obstetrics at the Denver Women's Clinic," the woman stated. Her voice cut through the murmurs. "The ultrasound belongs to a patient who gave birth in October. Chloe DuPont is not pregnant. She possesses a hormonal implant. She has been incapable of conceiving for 4 years." The devastating truth settled in. Julian turned his head toward the woman in red. His hollow, bloodshot eyes scanned the flat, unyielding curve of her crimson wool dress. Chloe said nothing. Her heavy gold bangles hung silent against her wrists. Her painted lips formed a hard, frozen line. Her silence was a permanent confession. She gripped her leather handbag until her knuckles turned white. The investors murmured. The realization washed over the room in a cold, damning wave. Julian Vanguard had destroyed his family, alienated a trillion-dollar empire, and triggered his own bankruptcy for a phantom. He had betrayed his bloodline for a hollow lie. He had traded $50 billion for a forged piece of medical paper. An older black man stepped forward from the front row of investors. He wore a traditional gray morning suit. He leaned on a walnut cane. Silas DuPont, patriarch of the DuPont shipping fortune. He walked toward his niece. His heavy footsteps echoed on the marble. He did not raise his voice. He did not shed a single tear. "You hold no shares in the DuPont family trust, and you carry my name no longer." He turned his back to her. He walked toward the heavy brass exit doors. He did not look back. The reckoning was not over. Tessa stepped out from the shadow of the abandoned piano. She wore the expensive camel hair coat Maya had purchased for her at Bergdorf Goodman. She carried the same thick manila envelope from exam room 4. The heavy paper shook in her grip. She walked to the edge of the champagne stain. She dropped the envelope onto the marble. The divorce papers spilled out, soaking into the sticky residue of Julian's ruined gala. The black ink bled into the spilled Dom Perignon. "I lied," Tessa whispered. Her voice shook. Her hands trembled. "Julian promised me the estate manager position. He promised me equity to hand you those papers in the hospital. You were my sister, Maya. I sold you for a penthouse allowance." Maya looked at Tessa. She remembered the shared blueberry muffins in the plaza break room. The pastries were always stale, but they ate them on overturned milk crates, planning their escape from poverty. She remembered the laughter in the damp hotel laundry room, the smell of industrial bleach masking their shared secrets. She remembered the girl who swore eternal loyalty over a folding table. Maya rested her hand on her recovering belly. She offered Tessa nothing, not anger, not forgiveness, just the cold, vast emptiness of a closed door. She wrapped her arms tighter around Arthur Jr. Tessa lowered her head. She retreated into the anonymous crowd. Julian Vanguard stood in the center of the ruin. The bespoke charcoal worsted wool suit hung off his shoulders like a borrowed shroud. The sweat on his forehead caught the light of the baccarat chandelier. He looked at the shattered remnants of his empire scattered across the floor. He looked at the woman in red who had orchestrated his downfall. He looked at the flashing cameras of the press corps documenting his public execution. He raised both hands. He forced a desperate, hollow smile. "Listen to me," Julian announced, his voice cracked. "This is a temporary liquidity issue. We can restructure the debt. The Cayman accounts are insulated. I still hold the majority voting rights to Vanguard Holdings." Wall Street investors turned their backs, whispering to each other about a golf tournament in Pebble Beach. Beatrice Vanguard stood by the half-melted swan ice sculpture. She gripped her diamond-encrusted silver cane. She did not look at her son. She stared at the puddle of dirty water soaking into her silver mink coat. No one looked at him. His mouth continued to move. Words spilled from his lips. Percentages, assets, leverage, margins. The room ignored the noise. The apex predator was a ghost screaming in an empty hallway. The investors shuffled toward the exits, eager to distance their own portfolios from the Vanguard contagion. Maya smoothed the cream wool blanket over Arthur Jr. The baby slept, his tiny breaths a steady rhythm against her chest. She braced her right hand against the armrest of the velvet chair. The surgical staples pulled tight across her pelvic bone. She ignored the jagged spike of pain. She found her footing on the marble floor. She stood from the velvet chair. She hesitated. The motion stalled. Maya released her grip on the velvet chair armrest. The surgical staples binding her lower abdomen pulled tight. A white-hot, jagged line of fire traced across her pelvic bone. She welcomed the agony. The pain meant she was alive. The pain meant the freezing concrete of the St. Rees loading dock had failed to claim her. She stood. The movement was slow. It was deliberate. It possessed the heavy, inevitable grace of a tectonic shift. 400 of America's wealthiest titans took a collective step backward. The synchronized shuffle of expensive leather soles against the marble floor echoed off the vaulted ceiling. They parted like dry grass before a wildfire. They gave her a massive, empty radius. They recognized the true apex predator in the room. It was not the silver-haired man wielding the ebony cane. It was the woman holding the newborn heir against her chest. Julian Vanguard remained marooned in the center of the sticky, champagne-soaked ruin. His bespoke, charcoal worsted wool suit clung to his sweating shoulders. The fabric hung heavy and misshapen. He looked at the massive projection screen above the mahogany tasting bar. Elias Thorne stood motionless in the shadows, his thumb resting over the silver remote control. Elias pressed one final button. The screen shifted. The digital security footage of the Denver Medical Clinic vanished. A live Bloomberg financial terminal feed replaced it. The ballroom bathed in the harsh green glow of scrolling market data. The numbers cascaded in a relentless waterfall of corporate destruction. Vanguard Holdings stock plummeted in real time. The chart line formed a jagged vertical cliff. $50 a share, $20 a share, $5. The red ticker symbol blinked. A thick crimson line slashed through the letters. DEL listed asset, Caesar pending. The hum of the massive screen was the only sound in the room. The silence of his former peers was deafening. They watched a trillion-dollar empire evaporate into digital dust. Nobody moved to his defense. His executive board members stared at their own scuffed shoes. A heavy brass door at the far end of the ballroom clicked open. The elite security contractors in midnight blue suits stepped aside. They formed a rigid column. 3 federal agents in dark windbreakers marched through the frame. The yellow letters stamped across their backs read, SEC. They did not look at the baccarat chandelier. They did not look at the melting ice. They marched straight toward the woman in red. Chloe DuPont backed away. Her ruby-painted stiletto heel caught the thick edge of a hand-tufted Persian rug. She stumbled. A dozen heavy gold bangles crashed together on her wrists. The frantic clanging exposed the severe tremor in her hands. She clutched her leather handbag tight against her flat stomach. The protective gesture was a hollow, pathetic reflex for a child that did not exist. The lead agent stopped 2 feet from her face. He handed her a thick manila folder. Chloe DuPont, you are being served with a federal indictment for wire fraud, corporate espionage, and racketeering. Chloe stared at the yellow envelope. She did not raise her manicured hands to take it. The agent let it drop. The heavy paper slapped against the marble floor. It landed next to Tessa's discarded divorce documents. The ink of her ruin bled into the spilled vintage Dom Perignon. The 2 backup agents stepped forward. They grabbed Chloe by the elbows. Their grips dug hard into the crimson wool of her dress. They dragged her toward the floor-to-ceiling glass walls. The aspen morning sun glared through the reinforced panes. A mob of press photographers pressed their heavy camera lenses against the glass. The media had arrived to document a corporate funeral. The agents shoved Chloe's shoulders. They forced her through the side exit doors. The freezing mountain wind hit her unprotected face. The flashbulbs erupted. A blinding, continuous strobe light of public execution washed over the snowbanks. Dozens of microphones thrust toward her chin. The journalists screamed, overlapping questions about the forged ultrasound. They asked about the missing $50 billion. They asked if Julian Vanguard was a co-conspirator in the medical fraud. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut. She turned her head. The crimson dress offered zero insulation against the biting ice. She shivered in the sub-zero air. The heavy gold bangles offered no warmth. She had no coat. She had no husband. She had no empire. She was a ghost bleeding color into the white snow, paraded before the same world she had tried to manipulate. The heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing her in the freezing storm of public ruin. The lead federal agent turned his attention back to the center of the ballroom. He pointed a steady finger at Julian. The 2 agents marched across the sticky marble. Squeak! 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 The rubber-soled shoes destroyed the quiet dignity of the grand space. Julian retreated a single step. His Italian leather Oxfords found zero traction on the champagne residue. He looked at the men approaching him. He looked at the yellow SEC windbreakers. He looked at the shiny steel handcuffs clipped to their heavy leather belts. The reality of his physical confinement slammed into his chest. Julian Vanguard, you are under arrest for securities fraud, massive embezzlement, and violating the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Julian's chest heaved. The air left his lungs in a ragged gasp. He turned his bloodshot eyes away from the agents. He searched the massive room. He bypassed the silent investors. He bypassed his mother. He locked his desperate gaze on the cream cashmere coat holding his newborn son. Maya, tell them to stop. The plea was a raw, scraping whisper. It held the pathetic desperation of a beggar demanding alms from a monarch. Maya did not blink. She held Arthur Jr. tighter against her collarbone. The infant radiated a steady, living heat through the thick cashmere. His tiny chest rose and fell in a calm, rhythmic slumber. His dark, bruised skin smelled of warm milk and survival. He was safe. He was secure. He would never know the cold concrete of a loading dock. He would never know the cruel bite of a father's contempt. She rested her right hand flat over the recovering hollow of her belly. The phantom weight of her pregnancy anchored her to the floor. The pain in her surgical incision solidified into a heavy, permanent armor. She was the architect of this ruin. She had made the call. She had unleashed the hounds. She felt no guilt for the blood on the floor. Arthur Sterling stood beside her. He rested both hands on the silver handle of his ebony cane. He watched the federal agents close the distance. He did not smile. He simply witnessed the precise mathematics of his vengeance execute itself in real time. The lead agent grabbed Julian's right wrist. He wrenched the arm backward. He twisted it high between Julian's shoulder blades. The bespoke charcoal worsted wool jacket stretched past its breaking point. The seam at the shoulder tore. The sound was a sharp, pathetic rip of expensive fabric giving way to brute force. The second agent drove his heavy boot into the back of Julian's knees. Julian collapsed. His knees struck the sticky, champagne-soaked marble. The brutal impact sent a white-hot shockwave up his spine. The cold, stagnant puddle of vintage Dom Perignon seeped through the knees of his worsted wool trousers. He knelt in the exact posture of a maid scrubbing baseboards, lacking only a heavy plastic scrub bucket. The floor smelled of rotting yeast, melted ice, and ruined pride. The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Click! Click! The metal bit into his skin. The heavy chain pulled his arms tight against his back. The pain was sharp. It was permanent. The unchecked corporate titan was tethered like a common thief. He looked up. From his knees, the world transformed into a towering, oppressive forest of tailored suits and expensive shoes turning away from him. He saw the scuffed toes of his own Italian leather Oxfords. He saw the jagged, broken shards of the baccarat crystal flute he had shattered against Maya's chest 12 hours ago. The glass caught the harsh glare of the baccarat chandelier, mocking his catastrophic fall. He looked higher. He saw the flawless hem of her cream cashmere coat. He saw the rigid, unflinching line of her posture. He saw the tiny striped hospital blanket wrapping the air he had thrown into the freezing darkness. He saw the billionaire heiress who had scrubbed his baseboards just to understand his heart. He saw the woman who now owned the ground he bled on. She was a monolith. She was untouchable. A single bead of sweat dripped from his brow. It stung his bloodshot eye. Maya. Just her name. A broken, breathless exhale. A final, pathetic gasp from a dead king. Maya looked down at the man kneeling in the sticky ruins of his own arrogance. She studied the terrified tremor in his jaw. She studied the torn seam of his bespoke jacket. She studied the cold steel biting into his wrists. She felt zero anger. She felt zero sorrow. The blizzard had frozen those naive, clinging emotions to death on the St. Regis loading dock. The girl who cried in the laundry room was dead. The woman who stood in her place was forged in cold, unyielding iron. She did not need an apology. She did not need his understanding. She only needed his absence. She parted her lips. Her voice was quiet, steady, and calm. "You are already forgotten." She turned away. The heavy cream cashmere coat swept the cold air. She did not look back. She walked toward the grand brass doors at the far end of the ballroom. She moved with the slow, measured cadence of a woman who carried the weight of a dynasty. The sea of billionaires parted wider. The titans of industry lowered their eyes in silent, reverent submission. They did not dare look directly at the heir to the Sterling Empire. Arthur Sterling walked a half-step behind her. His silver-tipped ebony cane struck the marble in a steady, rhythmic march. Click, click, click. Elias Thorne followed in the shadows, carrying the leather folio holding the transcript of a dead man's cruelty. Maya held Arthur Jr. close to her heart. The baby slept through the total destruction of his father's legacy. His miniature hands remained curled into tight fists. He breathed in the rich, soothing scent of his mother's warmth. Maya pressed her hand flat against her recovering belly one last time. The hollow ache faded into the quiet, unstoppable strength of her forward momentum. The elite security contractors stepped aside. They pulled the heavy brass handles. The grand oak doors swung wide open. The crisp, biting aspen air rushed into the stale ballroom. It washed away the suffocating smell of roasted pheasant and black truffle oil. It cleared the air of Julian's expensive mint breath. It smelled of pine needles and clean, unbroken ice. Julian knelt on the sticky marble. He watched her walk away. He tried to lunge forward. He tried to scream her name one last time to halt the avalanche. He could not move. The jagged edge of the steel handcuff bit into his wrist bone, slicing the skin. The federal agent drove a heavy knee into the center of his spine, pinning his chest flat against the cold floor. He watched the heavy oak and brass doors swing shut. She walked out into the bright mountain sunlight, resting her cheek against the sleeping infant's head.